So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rachel Wurzberger. I'm going to moderate this session. We have three distinguished speakers with us this session. We have Professor Jonathan Garb from the Hebrew U, Dr. Michael Kegel, and Professor Philip Wexler. And our session is called Interdisciplinary Applications of Hasidism. So I'm glad to introduce Professor Jonathan Garb from the Hebrew U. Professor Garb is a Gershom Shalom Professor of Kabbalah in the Department of Jewish Thought at the Hebrew University. Received his doctorate in 2000. He was a postdoctoral fellow in the Ben Gurion University of the Negev, guest lecturer at L'École des Hautes.
L'École des Hautes Études.
Thank you. L'École des Études, something in Paris, and a fellow at the Tikva Center for Law and Jewish Civilization in New York University. His lecture is titled The Hasidic Contribution to Psychology.
Thank you, Rachel. So I'd like to begin this presentation by thanking my friend Professor Philip Wexler, not only for, together with Rabbi Schmidt, organizing this exciting event, I think also a unique event, I would say, and not only even for about 15 years of joint work and study and reflection, but especially for his marvelous inspiration. I still remember my excitement when Professor Moshe Idel was then my thesis advisor, kindly lent me his copy of Philip's Holy Sparks, Social Theory, Education and Religion, and warmly encouraged me to read it. And even then I sensed the revolutionary potential of his approach for the study of Hasidism and of Jewish civilization in general. Philip was essentially called in for moving from analyzing Hasidic texts through the lens of social science, of sociology, of psychology, anthropology, towards uncovering the internal indigenous forms of social thought that are found in the texts themselves. And then, as a second and vital step, critiquing and re-evaluating Western theory and conventional approaches in light of ideas that emerge from the Hasidic sources and other Jewish mystical sources. Now, this shift blended well with the direction of my own work, as I moved from my early work a kind of compromise between analyzing Kabbalistic ideas of power and applying Foucault to them, and then a similar stance with regard to trance and Western hypnotic theory, and towards now describing Kabbalistic psychological thought more from within, as an independent form of modern European psychology, basically to say that Kabbalistic and Hasidic psychology are independent forms of European psychology. And this is expanded on in a manuscript that I have submitted recently. So what I'm claiming these days is that modern Kabbalistic psychology should stand alongside psychoanalysis and other secularized forms of psychology. And I say secularized because another book that I actually reached through Philip, Suzanne Kirchner's book on the religious roots of psychoanalysis, shows that psychoanalysis is really a secularized form of psychology rather than a secular form of psychology. And what I'm claiming is that basically we have what the great late Israeli social scientist Shmuel Noach Eisenstadt, joint inspiration I would say, referred to as multiple modernities. In other words, that psychoanalysis and Kabbalistic psychology are two forms of modern psychology that stand alongside each other, and therefore interpreting Kabbalah through psychoanalysis is as legitimate, no less, no more than interpreting psychoanalysis according to Kabbalah. So, in other words, psychoanalysis and other forms of thought, such as Hasidism, are products of modernity. Now, I will add that just one other rule that I've learned from Philip is to embed any form of thought, for instance, such as sociology, social psychology, etc., and Hasidism, in a full context of cultural and intellectual history. That is, to see ideas in context as part of modern history. Now, this is why one of my critiques of some of the important research on Hasidism, which has been pursued for what is now just over a century, that is, if we count, let's say, from Martin Buber's book on Reb Nachman, 1906, we can say we've got about a century of the academic study of Hasidism, plus minus. And the problem that I want to isolate here is that for all of its richness and scope, which I'll of course expand on, Hasidism cannot be isolated from other facets of Jewish modernization. First of all, that of modern Kabbalah. And secondly, Musar. And third, the literature of Haskalah that was mentioned a lot this morning by Professor Idel. And Halakha, as Maoz Kahana also discussed at length. And as I argued in my lecture in Philadelphia, in the first of these series of conferences, which actually I had the privilege to attend all three. What I argued today is that it's no coincidence that, as Professor Lowenthal pointed out in his book on Chabad, the first book printed by Baal HaTanya was The Laws of Study of Torah. So that we start with Halacha. Now, I want to conclude these introductory comments before then get into my main theme. And my main theme today is positive psychology. In the same decade as Buber's book about Reb Nachman, William James delivered and published his lectures on the varieties of religious experience, of course a classic in the field. And there and elsewhere in his large corpus, such as his subsequent book on pragmatism, James pointed at the healthy-minded form of religion and its beneficial effect on psychological life. And now he says at the beginning of the fourth lecture, the more complex ways of experiencing religion are new manners of producing happiness. So each form of religion is a manner of producing happiness, and especially he emphasizes new forms, that is, modern forms of religion are new ways of producing happiness. And he contrasts that type to the type of a sick soul that probably he himself belonged to, his own depressive experiences. Now what's important here is that James, as the author of a pluralistic universe, says there's a variety of religious forms that cover the range from joy to despair. And to use a halachic phrase, again, there's place on the head for two sets of tefillin. There's place on the head for psychologies of joy and psychologies of despair. Now, while sharing the stress on the importance of William James, as in Philip's latest book, I have to interject two critical comments. The first is that James is very close to his contemporary, Max Weber, in positing ideal ahistorical types. So in this lecture, James moves seamlessly from St. Francis of Assisi to Cardinal Newman in the 19th century and Walt Whitman at the end of the 19th century. And my alternative approach is to regard healthy-minded or melancholy forms of spirituality as expressing historical tides within the ecstatic and tragic and always raging sea of modernity. So it'd be unwise to see these two central options of a sick soul and a healthy-minded soul, of joy and despair, as separate figures, or even as phases in medieval mystical psychology, or very edge of modernity, let's say in The Dark Night of the Soul by San Juan de la Cruz in Spain. We have the idea that we've got different phases of going through despair to joy, etc. But actually, as von Goethe puts it in the 18th century, two souls dwell within my breast. There's room in the heart for two souls. And as Baal HaTanya puts it, he's the contemporary of Goethe, almost the same years, and he says it in chapter 34 of Tanya, there's no obstacle to be despicable and disgusting in one's eyes and broken-hearted and low in spirits at the time of joy, literally mamash. So mamash, one can be joyful and broken-hearted, lev nishbar, at the same time. Now, James is part of a wider approach in psychology, which I would term pragmatist psychology, and was echoed in a bestseller in the middle of the 20th century, The Power of Positive Thinking, written by Christian minister Norman Vincent Peale, 1952. Now, he began to propagate this approach, which has an element of hypnosis in it, in highly popular radio talks in the 1930s. And I don't think that we can disassociate Peale's talks in the 1930s on the power of positive thinking from the historical context of the Great Depression and the shadow of war, any more than one can do with the talks that were delivered at the same time, also very popular on the radio, the anti-Semitic talks of Father Charles Coughlin. Now, so that's one point. And the second thing is that James himself speaks about a movement of his time, at the turn of the 20th century, called the New Thought movement. And he says it's a genuine religious power. And then he says the following sage comment, which is highly relevant for some contemporary forms of Jewish mysticism, which relates to the end of the last discussion. It has reached a stage, he says, for example, when the demand for its literature is great enough for insincere stuff mechanically produced for the market, to a certain extent supplied by publishers. A phenomenon never observed, I imagine, until religion has got well past its earliest insecure beginnings. So the mercantilization is obviously a stage of self-confidence in the development of a religion. Now, James, New Thought, and Peale are all the intellectual and discursive antecedents for the movement of positive psychology that has strong adherents in Israeli adherents, even though they operate in the board at the moment, such as Tal Ben Shachar. And there was also a Jewish branch of New Thought. Already in the beginning of the century, in the first decade of the 20th century, there was a Jewish branch of the New Thought movement. It was called the Society for Jewish Science. Now, happily for me, what is the metaphysics? They describe God as an energy or force who penetrates the universe. Of course, a description very close to the philosophy of Sefer Tanya. So what I want to say, building from the Tanya text on the coexistence of joy and despair with a far more complex psychology than positive psychology, I would say that Hasidism is a parallel form of positive psychology. So just like positive psychology has its own antecedents, in the 19th, 20th century, we've got an earlier movement of positive psychology in Hasidism. And this is what differentiates, one of the main things that differentiate Hasidism from its many sources in the Musar movement of the 17th and 18th century, as painstakingly and exhaustively adduced by Mendel Kirkash. Now, I think that this understanding of Hasidism has implications which transcend the theoretical and reach both into the clinical and social realms, but I must caution that Jewish psychology should always rest on a firm textual basis. Now, and we'll get to this connection between joy and the text, or the joy in the text, later. So, I want to speak now about the power of thought, because we spoke about the book, The Power of Positive Thinking. I want to speak about the power of thought and positive psychology in Hasidism. Now, the power of thought, as Moshe Edel wrote an article devoted to this topic, is a core tenet of Beshtian Hasidism. And the Beshti is recorded as saying that where one's thought is, one's presence is, and he's also, there's a pithy saying attributed to the Besht, think good and it will be good. Now, seemingly using terms from Weber, this is a form of inner worldly mysticism. Because if a Besht is saying that where one is a function of where one think, what is one thinking, that is, thought dictates where one is, so one can then easily mediate the divine presence for the material world. It's very easy to bring the divine presence into the material world because one can be in a material world, and instead of ascending to the heavens, one can actually just think about the divine reality and bring it into the material world. And so to use a Beshtian scheme, the human dimension, or the soul, neshamot, can bridge the divine between divinity, Elohut, and the world, olamot. And also linking to another Beshtian discourse that Moshe Edel also devoted an article to this discourse, the wall between the divine and the worldly, the wall between the world and God is also an illusion. So in other words, as all is ultimately a matter of thought, the power of thought can expose the illusory nature of the material world and reveal the immanent divine reality inside it. And by doing so, it also reveals the illusory nature of evil that the Besht famously said is merely a chair for good, kisei latov. So in this reading, which tallies well with the Buberian interpretation of Hasidism, the gap between Beshtian psychology and positive psychology narrows. Both of them agree that external reality is malleable. Both of them think that evil is far less compelling than in numerous Kabbalistic accounts. And really everything depends on the cognitive scheme of the individual. Now, if this reading was correct, and I don't think it is, let me rephrase it. I don't think that it's necessarily representative of Hasidism as a whole, even though it can certainly be found in certain texts, but I don't think it's a very representative possibility. If this is correct, Hasidism would be susceptible to the critique of positive psychology in Barbara Ehrenreich's book, Bright-Sided. It's got two titles, but I can't remember which is the American edition, which is the European edition. Bright-Sided, How Positive Thinking is Undermining America. That's probably the European edition. So, Ehrenreich has indeed noted the presence of a mystical notion of transforming external reality through the power of thought, and she locates this idea within a cultural cluster that she critiques as being a form of denial of discomforting external realities, often of a political nature. And James Pawelski has noted in his study of James in positive psychology that James himself has a similar critique of what he calls mind cure, which is another ancestor of positive psychology, that mind cure is basically just like its descendant Christian Science, is a form of ignoring external reality when it's not comfortable. And for Chabad, at least, I think that Barbara Ehrenreich's critique is correct, that Chabad don't have such a rosy view of evil as maybe the Besht had, or maybe it's attributed to the Besht, and it's a question, soon we'll see what the Besht, maybe there's different layers and the Besht is thinking about it. So here's Balatanya, chapter 24, quoting Isaac Luria. All the occurrences of this world are harsh and bad, and the wicked overcoming it, Tarasheim Govrim Bo. Now, surely one will ask, the seventh Rebbe, whose passing we're commemorating here, balanced this quote in the discourse on Tammuz 13, 1959, with the rabbinic saying, 1 hour of repentance and good deeds in this world is more beautiful than all the life of the world to come. So part of the answer will unfold when I'll move to the question of the nomian and the law, and I can reinforce this answer by a brilliant analysis by Elliot Wolfson in his Open Secret book that was mentioned this morning, that for the Rebbe, first of all, he isolates the phrase repentance and good deeds. He says for the Rebbe, repentance surpasses the perfection of the Torah. because it enables the transformation of evil into good. So this is a pretty semi-anomian statement saying that repentance is above Torah because it can transform evil into good. And then Wolfson goes on to say that as for good deeds, even though on an absolute level the opposites of good and evil are not discernible and not distinguishable, Wolfson says a very important caution. There's no challenge here to Schneerson's commitment to the world of rabbinic halacha, which might suggest superficial comparisons to hackneyed portrayals of some earlier forms of Jewish utopianism, most notably Christianity, Sabbateanism, and Frankism, which we heard about this morning. So Wolfson says, rather, in the non-dual state, the human will is so aligned with the divine will that basically performing ritual is no longer performed on command and obligation. So ritual isn't heteronomic anymore. It comes from within, but not that ritual is anyway superseded. So therefore, I don't think that there's any contradiction between the approach of the Tanya towards evil and the seemingly utopian approach of the Rebbe in the discourse from 1959. Now, I want to, in which seemingly the last Rebbe neutralizes what the Tanya says, that the world is full of evil, by saying that actually our good deeds, etc., is more than beautiful than the whole world to come. But according to Wolfson's analysis, and I think it's correct, he's not really doing that. But I want to go back to the Besht. In his Pillar of Prayer, which has been released in a meticulous annotated English edition, which often introduces contemporary concerns into the translation itself, and here and there in certain points I correct the translation because it introduces Buddhist and feminist ideas in the translation itself. As for Buddha, that's a la Buddhism, yes. The Besht writes, at times the person works only in smallness. That is to say, he does not enter the supernal worlds at all, but rather thinks that all the world is full of his glory, and that he is close to him. And at that time he's like a child, that his intellect is only slightly large. And even though he works in smallness, he works in great adherence to the Kut. So this is, I think, maybe let's follow it with my handout. I think it's over there. Yeah, so, could I trouble you just to give out this handout of mine? Everybody's got it? Fantastic. He's already worked on it. Fantastic. Fantastic, thank you. Okay. So this was text number 1. Okay, so let's have text number 1 in front of us, and I'll analyze it a bit. The state of smallness, which is where the Kabbalists say, katnut, the forces of judgment and restriction, this is where the much vaunted indwelling of God happens. That is, the whole story of the indwelling of God, of immanence, belongs to the state of katnut, and this is often presented as the core Hasidic doctrine, but the Besht relates it here to katnut. In this state, one needs to use a power of thought to bring God close, just like I said before. One thinks of God in this world and brings him down, rather than ascending to God, with the way the Besht does in his famous epistle on the soul ascent, which has been much analyzed in scholarship. And then, this is one quote. The second quote is number 2, which I think is a parallel. When one is in constricted consciousness, it should also be with, this is Kalush's translation, by the way, it should also be with great adhesion to the divine presence, Shekhinah. Then in one instant one can think of the higher worlds and immediately find oneself in those higher dimensions. For accordance with where a person thinks, this is where one finds oneself. And if he or she, now this, I say that this is of course a mistranslation because the text clearly says haya. Now the translator in his preface says he's mistranslating in order to correct the mistaken impression that the texts were written originally for men. Yeah. However, just the basic historical facts about the state of knowledge of Hebrew among women in the 18th century in Eastern Europe precludes this interpretation. And reminds me of a very nice text that Daniel Reiser brought a couple of weeks ago, in which in the West the term Yidden was translated as every human. So if he or she would not be in a higher world, he or she, again, haya, huaya, would not be able to think in that dimension at all. Now, this is a rather difficult text, but I want to interpret it as follows. It's
Hebrew for constricted consciousness.
No, it's Ketnut Mochin. It's the same thing. Ketnut Mochin. I think that's what Kalish translates. Again, we see a slightly Buddhist tinge of translation. I'll give a stronger example later, which is nice, but again, historically, it's problematic. Dvekut, which is always presented as a central tenet of Hasidism, the connection to the immanent, to the Shekhinah, to the immanent God residing in the world, and Dvekut, again presented as a core ideal of Hasidism, all this belongs to the state of smallness, because the minute one reaches the state of greatness, one realizes the true power of thought. The true power of thought is by instantly ascending to the higher world. So for, let's say, I would say, possibly like Chaviva Padaya interprets the epistle, there's possibly a more popular layer here, which is based on Dvekut and connection to the immanent. And the layer for the elite is the matter of contemplation. And there one realizes the full power of thought, that just by thinking about being in a higher world, one can ascend to the higher world. Because the Besht says epistemology is preceded by ontology. So that if one wouldn't be in a higher world already, one wouldn't be able to think about it. So the mere fact of thinking about the higher world indicates that one is already in a higher world. And this is the true elitist form of Bechtian Hasidism. And of course, there is a more popular level, which is based on immanence and dvikut. So in this reading, the goal of Hasidic practice of a mystical elite is otherworldly rather than innerworldly, literally otherworldly of ascending. Why? Because this world is harshly dominated by evil. So therefore their aspiration is to go beyond this world. And this is why, in the word of the psalmist, which is in Psalm 23, which is sang by just about all Hasidim in the concluding third meal of Shabbat, which in Chabad isn't always literally a meal, but so it says the goal is to dwell in the house of the Lord, Shifti v'vet Hashem, beyond Gates el-Mavet, beyond this world, which is the valley of the shadow of evil. Okay, so that's one thing, the whole question of positive psychology. Now, a second thing I want to get into is the law. A second major difference which I see between Hasidic psychology and positive psychology is the salience of the nomian, because if it's one thing that Buberian reading neutralized, is the presence of the law of halakha, that one could read Buber's books and not even realize that there's such a thing as halakha almost. Now, again, in the manuscript I mentioned, I discussed the pleasure of the law, and here I want to move from Chabad to the branches of Lublin, the various schools coming out of Lublin. Now, first of all, Tzvi Elimelech Dinov, he writes in the introduction to Bnei Yisachar about the friendly, delicious, pleasant flow of the influx of holiness. So this is positive psychology, but he writes it's according to Seder Azmanim, it's according to the which he reinterprets not as a cosmic order, but as a ritual order. The order of the festivals, which is what all of this book Bnei Yisachar is about. That's a place where you locate the pleasure. That's where the pleasure descends according to the order. It's not an anomian process, it's a nomian process which depends on the festivals. Now I want to bring another text, again from the same world of the branches of Lublin, from Avram Bornstein of Shochachov. And this is one of these Hasidic halachists that Moses was speaking about. He writes in the introduction to his very deep composition on the laws of Shabbat, Eklei Tal. And he writes as follows. And this is text number 3. I've heard some people strain from the path of the reason with regard to the Holy Torah, in saying that whoever studies and innovates and takes delight in this, in study, is not studying Torah for its own sake as much as one who studies for the sake of a commandment without pleasure. That is a heteronomic mentality. For one who takes delight is mixing in his own pleasure. But this is a well-known mistake, and to the contrary, this is the basis of the commandment of studying the Torah, to be happy and joyful and take pleasure in one's learning. And then the words of Torah absorbed in one's bloodstream is the internalization of the Torah. And since he enjoys the words of Torah, he becomes adhered to them. And when one studies for the sake of commandment and also takes pleasure in one's study, this is study for its own sake and is entirely holy, for the pleasure is also a commandment. So the way I'm reading it, he's saying that one should study Torah for the sake of a commandment, but the commandment is to take pleasure in the study of Torah. So it's a circular reasoning. Now, I think Rabbi Avraham in his time was responding to pietist views of Torah study, so he has to stress that pleasure is also a commandment. I think in today one has to stress, even in the academy, that study is also a commandment. And that being commanded is also a pleasure. Okay, so a final difference between positive psychology and Hasidic psychology lies in the question of human agency. Because Barbara Ehrenreich in a critique, she says positive psychology has what she calls a harsh insistence on personal responsibility. Obviously, this is the ideology of the present form of capitalism, that there's personal responsibility, so all responsibility for social and individual ills lies on the individual, because if people would just learn how to think differently, all these ills would imagine they're not really part of the structure of society. Now, in my reading, which follows that of Rivka Schatz-Offenheimer, Hasidism belongs to the quietest branch. Again, when I say Hasidism, I don't mean that every single branch of Hasidism, etc. I mean Hasidism, grosso modo, as 60%, 65%, I don't know. Belongs to the quietest branch of the mystical family, together with the Catholic movement of Quietism and the Alumbrados movement in Spain and Pure Land Buddhism and various other mystical movements. So for positive psychology, the focus of positive psychology is that everything depends on the power of thought of the individual. And for many branches of Hasidism, one can only really make things happen through divine grace. But it's a big difference. Now, before demonstrating this point in detail, I want to address I want to say why I made this comparison between Hasidism and Quietism and Pure Land Buddhism, etc. Despite my critical comments about introducing Buddhist terminology in translations. Let me bring a quote. The quote is as follows: "Regard thyself as a son who has left his father, and wandering far." I don't think I brought this in a quote because this is like a surprise. I didn't bring this in a handout. This is a surprise quote. So it goes like this. So follow with me, please. "Regard thyself as a son who has left his father, and wandering far has at length fallen in with the army of his enemies. They have made thee a miserable captive and cast thee into the filthy dungeon. Thy father himself, moved with pity for thee, has left his household, and willingly become an exile and a wanderer in search of thee." So we've got the father who leaves his heavenly palace in order to descend into a filthy dungeon to redeem the captive. So where's this from? Tanya 46?
Right.
Yeah, it's like Tanya 46, no? But actually the source is Spiritual Exercise and Devotions of Blessed Robert Southwell, a 16th century Jesuit. Now, how the parallel between 16th century Jesuit text and Tanya come about, I can't go into that here. It's a complicated question. There's more phenomenology than history going on here. But there is a historical explanation of the similarity, but I won't give it here. Maybe in the Q&A. So let me return to Hasidism and build one more quote for the Pillar of Prayer. By the way, this is where I've got the Buddhist critique here. And this is in front of us. This is source number 4. "There are those who pray in despondency due to excess of black bile, marash chora, overcoming them, and think they are praying of great awe." So people mistake the marash chora for yirah, for awe. "Likewise, there are those who think that they have prayed out of a great love of the Creator, but it was due to their overworked." Now this word is absent in the text itself of the Besh, but it fits the context very well, so it's fine. Red bile. They've got too much red bile, marah duma, so they think they've got love of God. "However, if one is in a state of love of God, and out of this, a sense of self-effacement," now the text itself is actually busha-ish, which is not self-effacement but shame, descends on him or her, again the same problem, alav, "then it is good." So observe how it is that awe befalls you. I refer to not to the fear and awe that you arouse within yourself. The true awe, however, is experienced at being seized by a shuddering, trembling, and out of this awe of sudden realization, and of course this Buddhist term is absent in the text, one loses orientation momentarily, and does not know where one is. At times tears well up by themselves, but when it is not like this, it is nothing. It's again from a Pillar of Prayer. So contrived melancholy or ecstasy in prayer is simply biochemistry, as they would say today, overdose of some chemical element. And true fear or love of God is manifested in falling, that is a spontaneous shift, and tears that fall by themselves. And here one recalls Ehrenreich's critique of the forced nature of positive psychology, that positive psychology, he says, constantly needs to be pumped up. It's not a spontaneous thing. It has to be pumped up by seminars, by self-help books, by other products, by a shopping cart. So one can bring much supporting evidence from the text, for this text. This text by the Best very much reverberates in the Mittler Rebbe's, the book has been translated, The Tract of Ecstasy, quite a while back already.
Do you know what was the Hebrew for despondency?
Despondency is, I think it's Atzvut. I think it's Atzvut, yeah.
What's that?
Atzvut, yeah. Now there's also a text by Rashad that I'll bring in another article about shame, which is very, very, very good parallel to this text by Gabesh. And I want to just give one more Hasidic text, again through one of the schools of Lublin that my own ancestors on my father's side belong to, Ishbitzer Radzin. And Rabbi Yaakov Leiner writes in his Bet Yaakov, and I think this is also here number 5, "As sometimes desire and joy enter the heart of a Jew," so you know if it's translated as Jew, "without any reason, and in truth this grows from God beginning to build good, and from this his heart was moved towards God." So without any reason, it's a completely spontaneous occurrence. It's not contrived in any way. Conclusion. Do you have a paper time? Excellent.
15 minutes.
Sorry, 15? Okay, I'll slow down. Okay. So, now as Philip Wexler has taught us, to use Hasidism as a resource does not mean to reinforce prevalent trends in Western culture. But it's not as if we're going to now look in Hasidism and whatever's fashionable in Western culture, we'll find the Hasidic source. Positive psychology well serves the powers that be, as Ehrenreich has shown. And now, all the things that I spoke about today, the emphasis on the law, the emphasis on the true evil in outer reality, the emphasis on the textual study, and the emphasis on otherworldly cosmology, and the emphasis on divine grace, which goes along with it, all these can inspire a critical stance towards views that are dominant in Western society. And the Schneerson family was renowned for its fiercely independent stance, while never shirking the burden of civic engagement. And this carries over to all those affiliated with him, as Jan Feldman has shown in the important work Lubavitchers as Citizens, the Paradox of Liberal Democracy. So despite this not shirking the burden of civic engagement, the Friedrich Rebbe combated Soviet tyranny, and while Menachem Mendel supported Israel in its trials, he never sanctified the state and often questioned the policies of its leaders. So, therefore, what I'm saying is that Hasidic psychology can be seen as a subversive force, not necessarily as a force which reinforces the status quo. And I'll say one more concluding comment. It's fortunate for the study of Hasidism that due to Sholom's relative disinterest in Hasidism, it remained in what the famous historian of science Thomas Kuhn called a pre-paradigmatic state. In other places, we have a Sholomian paradigm on the Lurianic Kabbalah expulsion from Spain, etc., and which was Sabbateanism, which was then afterwards challenged. In the case of Hasidism, I don't think a paradigm ever really got established. So since speaking about Hasidism, I do have to tell one story, I guess. I remember when Sholem Library was first opened, I asked the librarian, Esther Libes, where Sholem studies on Hasidism. At the time, I didn't even have a separate shelf for them. After, possibly because of my question, they gave him a separate shelf. Afterwards, the shelf was even published as a book. And she said, well, Sholem didn't like Hasidism. And I think that was a very honest answer. So now I think the pre-paradigmatic state is actually very logical because of the huge complexity and diversity of Hasidic teachings. It's difficult to construct one paradigm about Hasidism. So I think we're in a much more advantageous situation when rather than challenging some kind of dominant doxa, we actually respectfully and collegially engage in an open discussion, and I think bringing together scholars from inside and outside academia is a very, very good way to go about it. Thank you.